Good afternoon, wherever you are, and welcome to this webinar organised by Resilience First. For those of you who were unable to see the opening video, Resilience First's mission is to help build resilience across business communities, whether those communities be defined by geography or special interest. We've invited you today to join this webinar as we feel the topic of transport for London is one that will be relevant for nearly all of you. And although TfL was formed in 2000 as part of the old Greater London Authority, I would remind you that the history of public transport in London began a long time before that with horse-drawn omnibus services back in 1829. I should also add that shortly after its formation in 1832, a cholera epidemic reached London, claiming over 6,500 lives. It was sadly the prelude to a series of outbreaks in the city, which eventually became a cholera pandemic, killed many thousands worldwide. So pandemics are nothing new to the capital or the transport within. The coronavirus of 2019-2020 has highlighted the complexity and the vulnerability of a modern transport system in a major city like London. Without any physical damage to the system itself, the virus has wreaked havoc on a fare revenue system that has traditionally sustained the network. The result has been a large cash injection from the government to sustain it for the short term, so we all have an interest in understanding what the future holds beyond the immediate crisis brought about by COVID-19. During the next hour, we look forward to hearing the very person who can offer some insight onto the situation within TfL. Hence, we're delighted to welcome Vernon Everitt, who is Managing Director, Customers, Communication and Transport at TfL. He's undoubtedly a very busy person, so we are especially grateful to him for his time on this webinar this afternoon. We're also fortunate to welcome back as chair for the webinar Mary Rose Page, who is Chief Engineer, Transportation at Atkins. Now, just before I hand over to Mary Rose, I'd encourage all of you on the webinar to ask questions of the speakers throughout the session by posting brief questions in the chat box to the right of your screen. And I'm sure the chair will pick as many as she can in the Q&A session towards the end of the session. But don't hold back, please post your questions at any time. So with that, I'll hand over to Mary Rose. Over to you. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Bina, for inviting me to chair this key webinar on keeping moving through the pandemic. With a vaccine in sight, but still having some months yet to move through, this is a timely webinar. Jumping back a year ago or so, which seems like a decade, to be frank, I was supporting Resilience First webinar in person, mingling in a swanky venue alongside Gareth Powell, TfL's Surface Transport MD. The topic then was prescient, building resilience on TfL's road network. That afternoon, Gareth presented an insight into TfL's vision on the future of transport, touching on the new envisaged sustainable transport modes, such as demand-responsive transport, personal transporters such as e-cycles and e-scooters, and today we're trialing them, cleaner vehicles, car clubs and taxi ride sharing and autonomous vehicles. Gareth interestingly highlighted TfL's open data sharing policy to support SMEs and the supply chain in developing mobility as a service applications and also the Internet of Things. And the keynote I took away last November was Gareth's challenge to his innovation directorate, and by inference, the supply chain, was to move from a reactive stance to proactive engagement with technology innovations. But none of us in the room could have predicted that 2020 would test global and London's resilience with a pandemic. And still, despite dramatic loss of bus and rail ridership that strained finances, TfL responded with resilience measures from the practical, such as cleaning and safety for their drivers, to reallocating road space for cycle and walking facilities and improvements for their customers, while also developing and launching an interactive, sustainable transport app, TfL Go. So London has kept moving through the pandemic, albeit at a different pace, but with a green recovery backdrop, which is welcome considering the climate challenge. And so the challenge now is to understand the new normal demands and build on the green recovery momentum and understand how best we in the supply chain can support TfL and the proactive engagement with technology innovations. And this leads me to our keynote speaker. And so I'd like to hand over virtually to Vernon to hear what his views are.
Thank you, Mary Rose, and thank you, Robert. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me to talk to the webinar today. I hope you're all well. I'm broadcasting from a shed in southwest London. I'm sure you're all in similarly a diverse range of office accommodations. So where to start, really? First of all, I guess, is just to say something a little about resilience generally, given the audience here today, because of course, as a transport logistics organisation, we had put an awful lot of effort into preparing ourselves to be resilient. I don't think any of us could have envisaged it would manifest itself quite in this form, the thing that we needed to provide resilience against. But we have, of course, had things like terrorist attacks on the transport network in the past, and indeed, although rather different, run things like the Olympic Games, which we treated as a crisis. So we have pretty well rehearsed internal resilience structures to be able to analyze and grasp and then react to what it is that we are confronted with. And we have a gold command structure pretty similar to what you would find in the police force or maybe in the army or one of the armed forces, so that we can immediately go to a structure whereby all of the right people were together, analysing the problem and, as I say, finding solutions to it. The other thing, and that was the case with COVID, we immediately stood up our gold command. We broke off a couple of members of us from our executive committee to have daily or twice daily in the early days meetings of everybody that were involved in the response. And that process of itself has proved to be pretty resilient. And as a key part of London, we were also part of the London resilience set up under the auspices of the GLA, which has brought together all of the main protagonists in responding. So the ambulance service, the police, us, the health service, of course. So the London Resilience Board has really pulled everything together so that there was a coherent London-wide response. And all of that is continuing. So as both Robert and Mary Rose have alluded to, the pandemic has turned our business on its head. And if I think back in March, it's barely believable. I've spent all of my 13 years at Transport for London trying to get people onto public transport. And overnight, we were asking people to stay off it. So government's message was stay at home, protect lives, save the NHS. And our job was to dissuade everybody other than key workers not to use public transport. It's quite a culture shift for an organisation like ours. So at one point, tube ridership was down to about 3% of normal ridership during the depths of the first lockdown, and buses were down to about 10 to 15% of normal ridership, and that's the lowest levels of travel that we'd seen in 100 years. We Also took a hit on our service levels, but quickly regrouped, I think, so that we got back to offering as close to a full service as we could, bearing in mind that many of our own staff were shielding or were otherwise affected by COVID. But so we kept everything going, and we've rebuilt from there, really. And I guess the major elements that we had to contend with are organising and communicating the fact that public transport itself is clean, is safe, and also that we were running a reliable level of service. So since June, really, we've been running back to pretty much normal. There are some exceptions to that. Waterloo City Line isn't operating at the moment, for example. And what we saw after the first lockdown was ridership spring back to about 35%, and towards, just as we were moving towards the second national lockdown, we got back to about 40% on the London Underground, and getting on for 60% on the buses. So and we use that period really to try to communicate that the network is cleaner than it has ever been. We are and continue to use hospital grade cleaning substances. They kill all viruses and bacteria on contact. There's antiviral disinfectant used that provide long lasting protection. Key interchanges are cleaned more frequently, including during the day, and all surfaces, poles, grab poles, and all of that are tended to every single day. 1,000 hand sanitizer points, now sponsored by Dettol, are available to everybody around the network, and we're using innovations such as ultraviolet light to clean some of the other moving surfaces, including the rails you hang onto when you're going down the escalators, for example. We also really had to focus on our own staff. Now, if you're a bus driver, many people were passing you as you board the bus and everything. So in the early days, we had centre boarding only. And over time, we have, in effect, sealed off the compartment, which the bus drivers use to provide them with added protection. A number of our colleagues, a number of our bus drivers have lost their lives with COVID. And it's an absolute tragedy. So we did absolutely everything that we could to ensure that they were protected from this virus. And there have been a whole host of things that we've introduced to do that, including, as I say, sort of sealing them in effect in the driver compartment in the same way as you would do if you were a tube driver. We also instituted the mandatory wearing of face coverings as well, and that's been another key message. Our customers really want to know that the network is clean, reliable, regular, and orderly. And by orderly, I mean that people are obeying the rules. And if we ask you to wear, or we tell you to wear, actually, a face covering, you wear one unless you're exempt. Now, that's been one of our key challenges, to make sure people do understand the rules, and that we work with the British Transport Police to ensure that those rules are in fact enforced. So it's not the job of the staff to enforce it, it's the job of the British Transport Police. So we work hand in glove with them, and their officers have stopped well over 125,000 people, prevented thousands of people from boarding a service without a face covering if they're not exempt, and thousands of fixed penalty notices have also been issued. In fact, the other week, the first court cases came for people who were frequently flouting those rules. So we're serious, because we're asking people to do this, or telling people to do this, because it's necessary to protect each other and to build confidence that people can travel safely around the network. So we will find out tomorrow quite what impact the lifting of the latest national lockdown will have. shops will reopen. One assumes there's going to be a bit of pent-up demand to get out there and partake of a restaurant meal or to go shopping for something other than the essentials. So that will be interesting too. But again, we're just urging people to travel at the quiet times. That's one of the other things that we do to build the resilience of the network and to ensure people can maintain social distancing, is to give them the times and places where the network is quietest. We almost had to flip our customer information on its head and tell people when the quiet times are. And one of the things that I'm hopeful of in future, and I'll come on to the future in a minute, is that we can help spread that morning and evening peak once and for all, so that we can actually provide on a sustainable basis and on an ongoing basis a network where we're not all crush loaded onto vehicles, because clearly that is unacceptable from now on. So in terms of future trends, I think it's a little early, although it's tempting to draw a conclusion straight away. I think it's a little early to be definitive on how this is all going to play out. What we do know is that clearly working from home, and we're proving it now, aren't we, those of us that aren't in an office, that we can work productively from home, and IT systems and our own internal business systems in our own organisations have been pretty resilient to this set of circumstances. So, and it is clear that there is likely to be more of a mix of people wanting to work from home and wanting to work in an office. We know from our own experience there are many people that can't wait to get back into the office, actually, or at least have the opportunity to do so and have that as part of a balanced way, of working. I think it's also easy to assume that everybody that we transport are going to work. In fact, most of our the people that we transport are going to things other than work. There's a concentrated commute at the beginning and the end of each day, but many people are going to hospital, or they're going shopping, or they're doing something else. They're performing some sort of leisure activity. So we do believe that as things start to open up again, and the doors aren't being flung open, are they, tomorrow? We're still in tier 2. We still have to be really careful. There are still very firm rules in place. But as we build out of this, and perhaps as the vaccine takes its course over the course of the early part of next year, we really will be able to welcome people back and help them travel around, but hopefully in a way where we'll be able to spread demand more evenly than perhaps we were doing pre this pandemic. We've been keeping in very close touch with our colleagues around the world on what they are seeing. There's a very tight-knit, well, I don't need you, and Atkins will know this from your operations around the globe. We're a very tight-knit community actually in transport, and we talk to each other a lot. And I talk to the other cities in the UK on pretty much a weekly basis. And we're all seeing pretty much the same thing. So the patterns that you're seeing in New York, in Madrid, in Paris, in Buenos Aires are pretty much mimicked here. And some people are ahead of us in terms of the curve and the way in which the virus is taking its course, and some are behind us. But we've been able to sort of really work closely together and compare notes and understand what's happening and what might be coming, which again adds to our resilience. We touched on money. Both Robert and Mary Rose mentioned the money, but unlike perhaps any other major transport authority in the world, we were more reliant on fare revenue than anyone else. So normally you have a mixture of fare revenue and perhaps government grant or some payment through taxation for running public transport in a city. 70% of our revenue was fare revenue. And of course, with those numbers that I just cited, that's taken a tremendous hit, which means that we entered into an emergency arrangement with government to help us through the first half of the year. We've recently concluded a deal for the second half of the year to take us through to the end of March. And you may have read today that we've also reached a settlement with government on the additional money which was required to get Crossrail open. Because while all of this has been going on, improvements to London's future transport network have been continuing, including the Crossrail project, which has now been brought, if you like, in-house to Transport for London in its final critical sort of testing phases. Work like the complete rebuild of Bank Underground Station has been continuing, the extension of the Northern Line and Barking Riverside. So there's been a whole bunch of transport improvements that have continued alongside running a core service over this period that will stand London in good stead. And clearly with the funding arrangements, we're now talking to government about what the longer term looks like, because we're not going to be back to pre-COVID ridership anytime soon. And we are still going to need to be able to run a full service levels as we help London recover and the rest of the country recover from this, because a London firing on all cylinders, a productive London firing on all cylinders, will also help fire the cylinders of the rest of the country and help with the levelling up agenda that the government and the Prime Minister and the Chancellor spoke about only last week in the 1 year spending round. So we're also looking to forge ahead with upgrading and making the case in future for upgrading the signalling on the Piccadilly line and things like the Bakerloo line extension and Crossrail 2, taking them at least to safeguarding, so that we can return to them when the funding climate lends itself to that. So it's been tough. The funding negotiations have been tough with government, but we've ended up in a good place. I think everybody understands the importance of a fully functioning transport system for this region, and we'll continue to talk to government, as I say, about the longer term. So that, in a nutshell, is the sort of journey that we've been on. The initial March impact of COVID and the massive shock that inflicted on the transport network and our revenue. The fact that we organised ourselves to be able to respond to that and to be able to communicate to our customers about what was required of them during these different phases of lockdown. The rigorous focus on cleanliness, safety and orderliness of the transport network as an essential precondition to being able to welcome people back to public transport and to walking and cycling, of course, when the time is right. Of course, walking and cycling has played a very important part in our response, and London street space and local traffic neighbourhoods and all of that have been a response to enable people to do things other than take public transport. So all of that will continue, all of that development work to make London a much more sustainable and a greener city as we emerge from the COVID pandemic will continue. We have a Mayor's Transport Strategy, and actually when you look at the outcomes the Mayor's Transport Strategy espouses, COVID probably hasn't affected much of it. It may have affected the trajectory through which we achieve some of the Mayor's Transport Strategy outcomes, but it hasn't changed them fundamentally. And we're looking forward to getting back and helping London, the whole region, and all of you in our supply chain to recover from this and get this great city firing on all cylinders again. Mary Rose, I'll leave it there if I may, and I'm very happy to take questions.
Well, we have some questions, and I've got a couple. And thank you so much. That was very informative, and it certainly seems like you and your team had a hugely challenging 9 months coping with those sudden changes and considering the amount of people, the mass transit you have to deal with on a daily basis. But I mean, one of the things I was thinking, the London Infrastructure Conference a couple of months ago, Andy Byford, he gave a very frank and inspiring speech, talk, and he talked about his top three targets in his agenda, which was COVID, obviously, and Crossrail, obviously. He was going to get that sorted, and he clearly is getting there. He's managing that. There's good news today. But the third item was getting a sustainable income stream from government. And we're all aware that, you're probably one of the few metropolitan cities, that we are one of the few metropolitan cities that have to more or less survive on income stream from transport. And so looking at that and considering the government's current levelling up agenda, how do you see London fitting in there? Does that mean that London is going to be levelling down, or are we going to struggle achieving the ambitious 2030 carbon neutral target set by the mayor?
I think there are a number of questions in there, Mary Rose, and no, it's okay. It's all right. I'll talk to them. I think despite the political rhetoric around levelling up, levelling down, and all the rest of it, I think there is a genuine attempt across the country to level up the transport and other infrastructure of cities around the country, and we want to play our full part in enabling that. Again, we work very closely with transport authorities all around the country, and we compare notes and we compare approaches. Fares and ticketing is a classic example where the introduction of contactless payment, for example, has revolutionised travel here and enormously reduced the cost of revenue collection so that it can be spent on the things that really matter, which is improving transport, not collecting revenue. And we're sharing all of that. And I think actually there's an aspiration to have a TfL in every major city and region. It may look different, it may feel a bit different, it may not be necessarily of London scale, but having an integrated public transport and sustainable transport organisation, I think, is the aspiration for most of the regions. So we want to play our full part in that. No one would argue that levelling up is the right thing, but as you imply, it must not be levelling down. Now, if London is to fend for itself a bit more, then there will probably therefore need to be some further fiscal devolution to the Mayor of London to be able to raise revenues directly himself. If they're not going to come directly from government, he needs another way of raising it. And of course, when you look at Crossrail is being paid for mainly by London through the mayoral seal and through other local sort of tax raising mechanisms. So it is possible. I think people sometimes think that fiscal devolution in London has been done, and it hasn't really. The mayor doesn't have the full panoply of powers to raise revenue himself. So all the while that happens, there does need to be some discussions with government about how we keep things balanced. And the government, after all, are basically they've taken in the train operating companies as well to enable them to keep going. And many of my colleagues around the country who run light rail systems and bus networks, that's being supported at the moment directly by central government. So I think what government has said to us as part of the second half funding settlement is they want to talk to us about a plan for us getting to sustainability again, to getting away from any reliance on grant and all the rest of it. So we will work with them on that. But I think there has to be some mix here and probably some consideration of what the mayor can actually levy himself. I don't think it will get in the way of progress towards a zero carbon city. That's a core tenet of the mayor's transport strategy. And as I mentioned in my remarks, COVID is an interruption to that. It hasn't dealt a complete blow, or any blow actually, from my reading, of any of the outcomes that we're seeking. So we're cracking on with everything we're doing for expanding the ultra low emission zone in October, getting more electric buses and looking at electric bus strategy around the place, getting all of those charging points put in. So all of that will forge ahead alongside the walking and cycling agenda to ensure that we don't have a car-based recovery, because that's the thing we must avoid. We mustn't take steps back to, and all of the advances actually before COVID on air quality and all the rest of it, we must fiercely protect those, because it really was changing our city and will again change our city and make sure that we do get a green recovery. So I'm optimistic, and I'm optimistic we will get people back onto public transport when the time is right. Maybe not, as I mentioned initially, in the numbers that we once had, but we need to be creative. We need to be innovative, and I'm optimistic about all of that.
Well, on that note, Vernon, we have a question from Rand Watkins here, which is, how has the expected change in travel behaviours and working patterns that you've referred to just now as well feed into your passenger modelling and demand forecasting?
Yeah, so we've like most people, we've been planning off a number of scenarios. So we actually created 5 scenarios against which to test the future, and we've sort of iterated those scenarios as we've learned more about actual travel patterns and about what we've observed as we've emerged from lockdown. So, we do think that so there are a whole bunch of outcomes that can happen, and we need to be prepared for all of them. So we've fed all of that and our central assumptions, which is a return to public transport, not in the near term to the numbers that we had pre-COVID, but a return to public transport, and also making sure that some of those schemes that we put in on walking and cycling, we would consult on making them permanent. So some of them had to be put in really rather rapidly, and all of the normal considerations that you would normally go through and the consultation that you would go through in order to put all of those in, what simply wasn't possible. But we now will get some breathing space to analyse the success of those, and for those that we decide have merit in making permanent, go through all of the right steps to put those in and to consult local communities and make sure that all goes in within an overall framework of getting London back on its feet. So we have those 5 scenarios. We're iterating it as we went along. We don't have a crystal ball any more than anybody else, but we do believe on the evidence that we've seen thus far, particularly after the first national lockdown, that we can get people back confidently and safely using public transport and using more walking and cycling facilities. And we'll just continue to iterate.
Good. Well, I'm trying to blend in some of your answers to the next question, and there's a relevant question here from Liam Harrison. The typical out of London commuter is far less likely to want to buy a season ticket now. So have there been any discussion on how to stimulate the market to travel again?
Well, of course, that's one of the things out of our control, and fair policy and all of that. But there have been discussions. I mean, in London, most people now use pay-as-you-go rather than a season ticket. And over a period of years, we've tried to sort of equalise the daily fare, if you like, the daily capped fare, so that you should be indifferent as to buying a weekly season ticket or just travelling every day. And so the pay-as-you-go fare and will cap you. If you keep using your pay-as-you-go, will cap you at the weekly rate. So you're indifferent to season tickets. And longer-term season ticket reliance in London has come down very, very rapidly over the years. As Liam says, that's not the case for heavy rail. And I think there have been suggestions that at least some of the train operating companies are looking to more flexible ticketing and maybe a 3-day-a-week season ticket or carnet type products as well. But I'm afraid I'm not privy to where the government is on this, because after all, now all of the revenue risk for the National Rail Network rests with central government, and they also need to sort of think about how they recover from all of this. But we do work very closely with the train operators on all of our operations, And it would be nice, wouldn't it, if there was a bit more integration of the way in which we operated our fares, and not least, I think, get more contactless payment facilities on more services. But we'll have to see how we get on.
Yeah, certainly I'd vote for that one. I see Laurie Quinn has put an interesting googly question to you. He said, is it too early for you to outline TfL's plans for New Year's Eve, which is traditionally can be one of the busiest nights of the year, and will we have fireworks displays, etc.?
No, it's already been announced that there won't be the traditional fireworks displays and so on. We will be putting something out probably beginning of next week on our plans over the festive period. So I'd quite like to keep my powder dry on that if I may. But it will be a different New Year's Eve and festive experience, I think, to previous ones, unfortunately.
Yeah, I can completely understand that. But Laurie also poses an interesting question. During the period, given the range of local government partners across London's boroughs and the national significance of the London's transport systems, which of course you only control the main corridors, how did you ensure that they were COVID safe corridors for the moving public around?
So by safe corridors, I'm just reading Laurie's question here.
Yeah.
Given the range of local government partners. Okay, so Laurie, I take it that you're talking about sort of street space and enabling people to maintain social distancing locally, because one of the other scenarios, of course, that we've been planning on is people doing more things locally. And it was very evident in the early days of COVID that people would be doing more shopping just by dint of there not being anywhere else to go. And all of that, and that we needed to, put facilities in place to enable people to keep a safe distance. So we actually have really, really good relationships with London's boroughs. We've worked really hard on this over the years. We didn't always get this right, and I'm sure it's some way short of perfection even now. But we have a great team of people that understand each individual borough and the different makeup of the boroughs. I mean, London's boroughs are very, very different and have different environments. And so we've just got our heads down and worked as hard and as closely with them as we possibly could. And the government are very keen on putting in sort of street space type schemes to enable more active travel. And therefore, we've worked really, really closely with the local boroughs on how that money is spent and tried to do that in an integrated way, which doesn't conflict with TfL's obligations for the major routes. So we run the red routes, which are only, as Laurie sort of says, a small proportion of the London road network, but to try and do it in a way which is complementary and not in conflict. So I know there's been controversy about a number of low traffic neighbourhoods and things like that. I think that's partly a function of the speed in which some of those schemes had to be put in. But I think overall, we're getting really positive feedback about that move to make local spaces more attractive and to enable social distancing. And as I say, I think we just need to make sure that as and when we come to conclude whether or not these schemes have been successful and make them permanent, that we go through the right consultation steps as well to make sure local communities and local boroughs get a fair say. So a lot of this has been led individually by boroughs. It's been led by us, but we do try and work together on these things.
And presumably funded from this 2 billion that the government provided in May. Yeah.
Well, we had a lot. We had a healthy streets budget already, because this was something to which so we've repurposed some of the healthy streets money that we already had, because that's a mayoral priority already as part of the mayor's transport strategy. But there is also, as you say, been additional funds being made available by local government, by central government, which has been given to local authorities. So we've just tried to make sure, to the extent that we can, that what that's been spent on has been joined up and isn't in conflict.
Good. I suppose on the same theme, there's another question here from Stephen Maslin, Vernon, and he says, as someone who advises on inclusive design, I'm interested to learn how inclusion has factored in the transport strategy during COVID.
It's such an important question. I think it's been at the forefront of our activity from the very beginning. And in fact, we set up a special process, given the speed with which a lot of things had to change. We set up a special process to make sure that we were carrying out effective equality impact assessments on all of this, and were, to the extent that we could, trying to get as much feedback as we possibly could from all of our friends in the organisations that look after people with disabilities. At TfL, we have the Independent Disability Advisory Group, IDAG, which is a standing panel of experts on accessibility issues. And IDAG really came to the fore because we were able to take things that we were intending to do to them in a very agile way to try and understand the impacts that it would have on our diverse communities. And indeed, to perform and check EQIAs. And in our business planning as well, we take meticulous care to make sure that accessibility is at the forefront of our thinking in everything that we do. I know everyone says that, but we really do it. We may not always get it right, and I think that sometimes we take things to the IDAG or to Transport for All or to one of our other friends, and they say, "Well, you really need to think again," and we do. We take into account their feedback, and we think very hard about what it is that we do. I think we would have preferred to have been able to have been slower and more methodical about the way in which some of the schemes were implemented, because it did give rise to certain challenges in terms of accessibility. But I think that was a function of needing to act very, very rapidly given the public health emergency that we were confronted with. But I'm really glad Stephen has raised that, to give me an opportunity to say that absolutely goes to the centre of everything that we do at our organisation.
Okay, Samir Began, Vernon, we've got makes a really good point. Car usage in London before the current lockdown was back up to 95% of pre-lockdown levels, and I could see that myself living in Southwest London too. If this recovers from tomorrow to the same levels quickly, what future is there for walking and cycling?
I think there's a very good future for walking and cycling, because there's both a mayoral and a national impetus behind making cities more sustainable. It is untenable for the recovery from COVID to be based around the internal combustion engine. It can't happen. Our city will come to a halt. That's one of the reasons we were criticised a bit when we suspended the congestion charge for a period. You'll recall at the very beginning of the pandemic, we reintroduced it, and we've applied it 7 days a week and extended the hours on a temporary basis, just partly to try and make sure that it isn't a car-based recovery. Now, the congestion charge zone is a relatively small zone in central London. Another example is when the school children went back to school in September, government were really nervous about that. They desperately needed to get schools back, and we worked really closely with them to lay on more buses and school-only buses, and to encourage school children to walk and cycle, and even scoot to school. So I think we'll get on top of this. I think more people will come back to public transport, and in terms of the longer term strategic direction for the city, it has to be founded on high quality public transport and more walking and active travel facilities like walking and cycling, and real money is being put behind the walking and cycling agenda, as we've just discussed. So I'm optimistic about it all, and our walking and cycling agenda is led. We have a walking and cycling commissioner at Transport for London, Will Norman, who leads a lot of this stuff. So it gets equal weight in our discussions to public transport. So I'm optimistic.
I've got a question on that, and I think I alluded to it at the beginning. When we met with Gareth at Resilience first webinar last year, he talked about sustainable transport for the future, and how we have to be proactive engaging with technologies. And my question is, how do we do that with you? I mean, you've got the technology label in your directorate, and I know Gareth has a directorate, a technology innovation directorate. So yeah. What's the best way for the supply chain to lean in and support you on this?
Well, it depends what it is. You can sort of use Gareth or I as your gateway into Transport for London. So everyone on this call now knows me, who I am. I'm very happy for my contact details and all the rest of it to go round. My area does look at, so we've led on all of the fares and ticketing innovations and the adaptation of TfL's own internal systems. We had a huge, TfL was a merger of lots and lots of other transport authorities, and we've had to work out a really complicated legacy technology estate that ran our congestion charging, our signalling systems, everything. So there's different types of technologies, and there are different types of innovations. And you should use Gareth or I as your entry in. So Gareth has been Gareth's innovation team, and you mentioned, I think, Michael Hurwitz in your introductory remarks, has been looking at the proliferation of cycle hire schemes and trying to get coherence around them across boroughs. And also Michael's been leading on getting the trial ready for e-scooters. So they sort of look at that end of things, and I tend to look at the other sort of heavier lifting, if you like, technologies. You mentioned open data right at the very beginning. I started the open data revolution at TfL 10 years ago, when all of the engineers said to me, what on earth will people do with this information if you put it out in open data form? And I said, I really don't know, but let's try. And it's led to a proliferation of products and services, particularly journey planning services in London. So, use Gareth or I.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for that. I think we've got a couple more questions just come in. One came in earlier about Transport Police from Tim Callahan. Once the lockdown is lifted, will we expect to see more enforcement on the network?
Well, I think there is already enforcement.
I think so.
And I just, partly the overwhelming majority of people play by the rules. There will be a proportion of people that don't need to wear a face covering because they're exempt. And we've introduced a badge now for that, so people can signify that more easily. But there will be a relatively small proportion of people who intend to flout the rules. And it's those people that we intend to enforce against. And so we'll continue to work with the British Transport Police. I actually went out on an exercise with them a few weeks ago to ensure that people were wearing face coverings. We've all just got to do the right thing. But we realise that there are some people who will refuse to do that, and we will use all of our enforcement powers to ensure that we get the maximum compliance that we can possibly manage.
Well, good luck on that. And we've got two, I suppose, aligned questions have just popped in. Building on Samir's point from Mark Harper, there has been a lot of talk in the press about reintroducing trials of road user charging in central London. Our TfL planning to introduce trials in 2021. And I think there's also talk in the press about increasing the congestion zone. I mean, you've already increased the days of the week and the hours, etc.
We have. So the Central London congestion charge is back up and running, and it has been for several months now. And as you say, Mary Rose, we've extended it to 7 days a week and extended the hours. There are exemptions for people that work in the National Health Service or who are key workers, but that's been part of our signal that we don't want there to be a car-based recovery, and we want walking and cycling and public transport to be the backbone of the recovery. We will, in October 2021, extend the ultra low emission zone, excuse me, to the whole of the north and south circular footprint of London. So at the moment, so that's back on the agenda, and that will happen. Now, whether there'll be other road user charging trials and things like that, that'll be a matter for the mayors in future. I think the whole country actually will have to sort of regroup around all of this. There were lots of cleaner air zones and stuff like that planned all around the country pre-COVID, and I think everybody needs to regroup around all of those too. But I would fully expect road user charging to remain on the agenda, but we will carry on with all of the things to which we are already committed. And the next really major innovation will be the extension of the ultra low emission zone to the north and south circular roads in October 2021.
Okay. And last question, I think. I'm not sure. I'm looking at Robert for the time, but I think we've time for one more question. With the move from Neil Muscrop, with the move towards electric vehicle use becoming closer, will TfL assist with the massive growth of charging points needed for this to succeed? And I'm going to tack on another element. Are we going to be seen to being pushed towards more private vehicle sharing rather than private vehicle ownership?
I don't know, if I'm honest.
Political issue, I guess.
Well, I think we've got quite a long history of car hire clubs and things like that. I remember when I joined TfL 13 years ago, there were car hire clubs, and you used to have a bay, near your house where you could order a van or a car if that's what you needed. I think car ownership amongst younger people has fallen, and more people have a propensity to use public transport, and that's what we want. I think, and of course, you've had Uber, and the like. There are Ola and other versions of Uber who have come in and garnered popularity amongst predominantly younger people, not exclusively, but younger people as well. So you can actually, in effect, not need to own a car. You can just summon one. So I think car clubs and car sharing is an interesting one. What we really want is to make the bus service faster and more attractive and a better option for people that might otherwise use their vehicle. We want to keep improving the tube and rail services in London. We want to introduce more integrated ticketing, as we were discussing earlier on, just to make the whole proposition around the uses of public transport and active travel modes more attractive relative to the car. Sorry, what was the first point? I answered that.
It was the extra electric charging point, I think.
Yes, thank you. Absolutely. We are full speed ahead. We're part of the GLA-led task force to get more electricity charging points in place. Full speed ahead on all of that, including rapid charging points.
Yeah, I've seen them popping up all around me.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think we've wrapped up our session for today, and thank you everybody for your questions. And more than that, thank you, Vernon, for your time, because I know it's precious and you've got a super important job to do. And I found it so interesting and really helpful as an insight into how our key client what your demands are and what you need support on.
Well, can I take the opportunity, Mary Rose, to thank you, Robert, and everyone on the call. You know, all of you, we're all working to a common purpose. I think everyone's interest is in safely and sustainably, you know, getting everything going again, getting the economy going again, and getting people back when the time is right. We are still in a public health emergency, but the time will come, and we're just really, really grateful to you and to everybody and their institutions on this call for all of the great collaboration that goes on to make that happen. So thank you.
No, thank you. And it's been a fascinating hour, and we've covered a lot of ground, and I really am grateful both to Vernon for his time and for Mary Rose for chairing the session. And we will be producing a short summary in due course and a recording of this, so you can catch up on some of the things that people have said. So it only really leaves me finally to close and to draw your attention to our next webinar, which is actually on Thursday of this week on risk and resilience, and we may be well returning to transport as part of that. So thank you very much for participating. Stay safe and goodbye. I hope to see you shortly. Thank you. Goodbye.